The world watched in disbelief as Donald Trump announced a ceasefire with Iran, a deal that was supposed to end weeks of brutal warfare across the Middle East. Markets surged, oil prices plummeted, and world leaders exhaled with relief. But within hours, the bombs were falling again, and this time Israel was the one dropping them. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran was announced late Tuesday night, just ahead of Trump's self-imposed PM deadline, a fragile two-week pause meant to give diplomacy a fighting chance. It was supposed to be a moment of stillness after weeks of fire and chaos. It lasted less than a night, because even as the ink was drying on this deal, a critical question was already tearing it apart, and that question had a name: Lebanon. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made his government's position crystal clear. Israel supports Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran, but the deal does not cover the fighting in Lebanon. That single statement changed everything. It wasn't a footnote. It was a bombshell. Pakistan, the country that mediated the entire agreement, said the opposite. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif stated plainly that the two-week ceasefire would also cover fighting in Lebanon. Two different stories, two different realities, and caught in the middle the people of Beirut. Iran maintained that Lebanon was absolutely part of the ceasefire deal they had signed on to. Iranian officials were furious. They believed they had traded something enormous, a pause in hostilities, only to watch their ally Lebanon get pounded on the very same night. The silence after a ceasefire announcement is supposed to feel like relief. In Lebanon, it felt like dread. On Wednesday, Lebanon's health ministry reported that Israeli strikes killed 182 people, the highest single-day death toll in the entire Israel-Hezbollah war, as a shaky ceasefire took effect between the U.S. and Iran. 182 lives. On a day the world was supposed to be celebrating peace, Lebanese President Joseph Aoun condemned the Israeli attacks as barbaric and accused Israel of committing a new massacre in the country. His words carried the weight of a nation that had hoped for just a moment that the worst was over. It was not. Heavy bombardment was reported in the capital, Beirut, and the Israeli military announced it had undertaken the largest wave of strikes across Lebanon since the start of its invasion. The ceasefire that was supposed to quiet the region had, in one terrible irony, coincided with its most violent day yet. And then came the numbers that made the world stop scrolling. The Israeli military said it struck more than 100 targets within just 10 minutes across Lebanon on Wednesday, the largest wave of strikes since March 1st. 100 targets, 10 minutes. This was not a skirmish. This was a statement. Black smoke towered over several parts of Beirut. Explosions interrupted the sound of traffic. Ambulances raced toward open flames. Apartment buildings were struck. These were not military compounds or fortified bunkers. These were neighborhoods. These were streets where families lived. The Lebanese armed forces announced that 4 of its troops were killed by Israeli airstrikes, 2 soldiers in the eastern Baalbek region, 1 in the southeastern region of Hermel, and 1 near the coastal city of Sidon. Soldiers of the Lebanese National Army, not Hezbollah fighters, killed during what the world believed was a ceasefire. How did we get here? To understand why this deal is already on the edge, you have to go back to the very beginning. The temporary truce came more than a month after the U.S. and Israel started the war on Iran on February 28, triggering a wider conflict that spread rapidly across the region. What began as a targeted campaign escalated into something far larger than anyone officially wanted to admit. Hezbollah, a proxy of Iran, had joined the conflict in early March. Israel and Hezbollah had engaged in ongoing missile and drone attacks, with Israel sending ground troops into southern Lebanon. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and Lebanon's health ministry confirmed that more than 1,500 people had been killed. In Israeli strikes, that was the backdrop when Trump announced his ceasefire, a region already scarred, already bleeding. Israeli officials were reportedly dissatisfied even with the way the ceasefire was announced. They were informed at a very late stage that the deal had been finalized and expressed frustration over the lack of consultation and specific elements of the agreement. In other words, Netanyahu's government felt blindsided, and when countries feel blindsided, they act unilaterally. So what exactly did Trump announce? And why is even the text of the deal a source of conflict? Trump wrote on Truth Social that Iran had provided a 10-point peace proposal, calling it a workable basis on which to negotiate. The core condition of the ceasefire was a complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of all traded oil and natural gas passes in peacetime. Iran's supreme leader instructed all military units to stop firing, issuing a statement through state-run media. This is not the end of the war, but all military branches should follow the supreme leader's order and cease their fire. Even the ceasefire order contained a warning. Even in surrender, the message was, this isn't finished. Iran's 10-point proposal included demands that conflicted sharply with America's own 15-point proposal, with Iran seeking continued control over transit through the Strait of Hormuz and the complete withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from its bases across the region. Multiple Iranian media outlets also reported that the 10 points included acceptance of enrichment for Tehran's nuclear program. That last point, uranium enrichment, is precisely where the deal's foundations become most shaky. Trump, for his part, claimed a historic victory on the nuclear question. But Iran told a very different story. Trump said Wednesday that Iran would not return to enriching uranium, and that its existing stockpile of 60% enriched uranium, believed to be buried under its heavily damaged Isfahan facility since U.S.-Israeli strikes, in June 2025, would be unearthed and secured in a joint U.S.-Iranian effort. Iran had not confirmed any of that. The gap between what Trump was telling the American public and what Iran was actually agreeing to was growing by the hour. One side was declaring victory. The other was denying the terms. Iran's parliament speaker pointed to what he said were 3 ceasefire violations by the U.S., including Trump's own comments insisting Iran could not enrich uranium, which he said contradicted a clause in Iran's 10-point proposal that explicitly recognized Iran's right to enrichment. A ceasefire with disputed terms is not a ceasefire. It is a countdown. And through all of this, Israel was busy making its own message heard, not in words, but in bombs. Netanyahu stood at a press conference and delivered a warning to the entire region. This is not the end of the campaign. We still have goals to accomplish, and we will achieve these goals, either from agreement and consensus or from renewal of the war, because we are ready to do so whenever necessary. Our finger is on the trigger. Our finger is on the trigger, from the Prime Minister of a country that had just agreed to a ceasefire. Let that sink in. Israeli Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Iles Amir declared that Israel would continue to utilize every operational opportunity to strike Hezbollah. This was not a rogue general speaking out of turn. This was coordinated policy, public, unapologetic, and directed straight at the ceasefire agreement the world was celebrating. Iran's response to the continued strikes in Lebanon was fast and furious. Iran's Revolutionary Guard issued a stark warning on Telegram, calling the continued Israeli strikes in Beirut a savage attack and threatening a regret-inducing response if Israeli strikes on Lebanon did not immediately end. The IRG does not use language like that lightly when the Revolutionary Guard threatens a regret-inducing response. The region listens. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Saeed Khatibzadeh told BBC News that Tehran had communicated its anger over the strikes directly to the White House, saying, "You cannot have your cake and eat it at the same time. You cannot ask for a ceasefire and then accept terms. Accept all the areas a ceasefire is applied to, name Lebanon, exactly. Lebanon, and then have your ally start a massacre." He also issued a direct ultimatum to Washington. The U.S. must choose whether it wants war or peace. That is not the language of a diplomatic partner. That is the language of a country deciding whether to walk away from the table entirely, and walk away they nearly did at the Strait of Hormuz. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz again, citing continued Israeli strikes on Lebanon as the reason. The strait, the very reason the ceasefire was struck in the first place, was back under threat. The global economy had celebrated for barely 12 hours before the oil markets were staring down the barrel of crisis again. Iranian media issued a chart outlining alternative traffic routes in the Strait of Hormuz, warning vessels about what it described as possible collisions with sea mines. All vessels intending to transit the strait were required to coordinate directly with the IRG Navy. This was Iran reminding the world and Washington exactly what leverage it still held. Every tanker, every cargo ship, every barrel of oil flowing through that narrow passage was now subject to Iranian military permission. The Arab League chief Ahmed Abul-Gheit accused Israel of persistently seeking to sabotage the Iran ceasefire deal. Even America's Arab partners in the region were alarmed. The countries that had just survived weeks of Iranian missiles hitting their own soil were now watching Israel unravel the deal that had brought them relief. Meanwhile, the missiles didn't stop even on the day the ceasefire was declared. Sirens sounded across the Gulf and in Israel as multiple countries reported incoming missiles shortly after Trump announced the ceasefire. Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates both said they were working to intercept incoming drone and missile threats. In Abu Dhabi, authorities said they were responding to a fire at the Habshan gas processing facility. Israeli officials accused Iran of having fired missiles after the ceasefire was supposed to have started, alleging one launch at 7:06 a.m. and two more at 10:25 a.m. that were successfully intercepted. Iran denied it. Israel prepared a retaliatory strike. Trump personally intervened, reportedly pressuring Netanyahu by phone to call it off. As Israel's jets were en route to attack targets in Iran, Trump pressured Netanyahu to stand down. Israel mostly obliged, carrying out a reduced strike targeting a radar installation near Tehran in response to what it called Iran's post-ceasefire missile launches. The ceasefire had nearly collapsed within its first day. Trump was literally on the phone talking nuclear-armed adversaries out of striking each other in real time. The core tension here goes deeper than Lebanon, deeper than missiles, deeper than any single strike. This ceasefire was built on a fundamental disagreement about what the ceasefire actually covers. Pakistan said Lebanon was included. Iran said Lebanon was included. But Israel and the United States said Lebanon was not included, and Trump told PBS NewsHour that Lebanon was left out of the deal specifically because of Hezbollah. That is a stunning admission. The U.S. deliberately excluded Lebanon because of a group it designates as a terrorist organization, knowing full well that Iran would consider continued Israeli strikes there a direct violation of the spirit of the deal. Washington chose to thread a needle that may have been unthreadable. Vice President G. D. Vance tried to explain the American position bluntly. I think the Iranians thought the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. If that is true, it raises a question that no one in Washington seems eager to answer. If the mediator believed Lebanon was included, and Iran believed Lebanon was included, then what exactly was agreed to? Back in Tehran, the streets told a story that no ceasefire announcement could fully suppress. Pro-government demonstrators in Tehran screamed death to America, death to Israel, death to compromisers. After the ceasefire announcement burning American and Israeli flags in the streets, these were not fringe protesters. These were the hardliners who have shaped Iranian policy for decades, and they were furious that their leadership had agreed to any deal at all. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian gave a televised address calling it a great victory. Iranian media claimed the truce had been imposed on the enemy after 4 waves of attacks on Israeli-occupied territories. Both governments, the Iranian and the Israeli, were framing the same ceasefire as their own triumph when both sides claim victory from the same agreement. It usually means neither side has actually won and neither side is done fighting. So what happens now? What does the next 2 weeks actually look like? Pakistan's Prime Minister has invited delegations from both Iran and the United States to Islamabad for talks on Friday, April 10th. Those negotiations will determine whether this 2-week pause becomes something permanent or whether it becomes the brief intermission before the next act of a war that nobody officially wanted. U.S.-Israeli strikes have battered Iran and its leadership, but they have not entirely eliminated the threats posed by Tehran's nuclear program, its ballistic missiles, or its support for regional proxies like Hezbollah. That is the brutal math of this conflict: weeks of war, billions of dollars in damage, thousands of lives lost. And the core strategic problem remains unsolved. Defense Secretary Hegseth told a Pentagon briefing that the U.S. would do something like last June's joint strikes with Israel on Iranian nuclear sites if the country refuses to surrender its enriched uranium voluntarily. Even in the ceasefire, the threat of renewed war hangs over every conversation. Here is what we know right now. On this day, as the world watches this fragile experiment in Middle East diplomacy, a ceasefire exists on paper between the United States and Iran. Israel has formally endorsed that ceasefire. But Israel continues to bomb Lebanon, killing hundreds of civilians, in strikes its own military chiefs have vowed will not stop. Iran is furious, threatening consequences, and has already reclosed the Strait of Hormuz once. The terms of the deal are disputed by every party involved, and both sides are publicly insisting the war is not over. Trump himself uttered an expletive on live television, expressing frustration with both sides for not upholding the ceasefire, saying they did not know what they were doing. The architect of the deal was, within hours of announcing it, watching it fall apart in real time. This is not a ceasefire in any traditional sense. It is a pause in which every party is positioning, threatening, and preparing for what comes next. The bombs may have slowed on one front, but the war, the real war, the war of intentions and nuclear ambitions and proxy armies and disputed straits that war has never stopped, trumps. Deal faces its first test. Israel has already answered the question of whether it will stop fighting. It will not. The question now is what Iran does next and whether the next 2 weeks produce a real agreement or simply buy time for the next explosion. The ceasefire is alive barely, and the whole world is watching to see how long it survives.